Hello, and welcome to Objective Health, another exciting episode. I am your host, Doug, and with me is Elliot.
Hello.
We are doing another bro show today. It's just the two of us. It's Bro Show Part 2. Last one we did was the one we did on Soy Boys. One of our more popular videos, actually. So, yeah. Tiff and Erica are not with us today, but as usual, as always, is Damien on the Wheels of Steels, the ones of twos. Ones and twos. We can't actually hear Damien. We're having technical difficulties. So today we are going to be doing a show on degeneracy. Then that's like a little bit difficult to define to a certain extent. It's like, what exactly are we talking about? We're kind of been noticing in the headlines. I mean, it's been going on for years, but it seems like things are really kind of picking up pace with the general degeneration of society. I mean, in terms of kind of its moral character, intellectualism, all those sorts of things. Like everything just seems to be degenerating. And we might be witnessing kind of the collapse of a civilization here if we just look at kind of what's going on in the headlines. Degenerate is defined as to sink into a low intellectual or moral state. And I think that is generally what we're witnessing. And if we sound like we're being crazy here or prudes or something like that, maybe stick with us and we'll see if you can't convert you to our way of thinking, because it really seems like things are falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe to start with, we can talk about, there was an article that was on, what was the website?
It was Undercover DC.
Undercover DC, thank you. Yeah, that's what it's called. It was written by a journalist named Celia Farber, and she was covering. There's a trial going on right now that is getting absolutely no media attention, despite the fact that it is like huge. It's unbelievable what's actually being revealed in this case. So basically, you might have seen some videos floating around a little while ago where some undercover journalists were talking to Planned Parenthood people. Posing as people who were trying to buy body parts, for like fetal body parts from abortions. And some of the stuff that is... so they've been sued, essentially. And, you know, instead of the Planned Parenthood actually coming under fire for this, it's the journalists who have revealed it that are coming under fire for it. So giving away all these secrets. But... the stuff that's actually coming out about it is truly jaw-dropping. Jaw-dropping. That's what I meant to say. So there's a couple of like quotes from the article that I just wanted to read. There are quite a few of them, but I'll try and keep it brief. So it said, on one day in June of 2014, the report states, an ABR technician obtained a 20-week-old fetus at a Planned Parenthood clinic, for which it paid the clinic $60. From that one fetus, ABR sold its brain to one customer for $325, both of its eyes for $325 each, that's $650 total. To a second customer, a portion of its liver for $325, to a third customer, its thymus for $325, and another portion of its liver for $325, to a fourth customer, and its lung for $325 to a fifth customer. ABR, the report says, procured the fetus at 9 a.m. at a Planned Parenthood clinic along with three others. By 1 p.m. in a 4-hour window, ABR earned $6,825 if you include service fees, shipping, disease testing, cleaning, etc., etc. So essentially what's being revealed here is that they are making a bundle off of fetal body parts, which is, you know, never what's actually... that kind of thing is never really brought up. You know, the leftists have kind of like idolized this abortion process and kind of like put it down as a right, and they glorify it. And, you know, it used to be kind of considered like a last ditch kind of thing to do if things were really bad and you needed to, like, you know, it was, if it was necessary, you did it, but it wasn't something you were proud of by any stretch of the imagination. And now it seems like it's kind of come to the point where it is something to take pride in. Like, people are almost taking pride in their getting of abortions, but this side of things is really something new, something that I hadn't encountered before, and I find it like quite shocking, to say the least.
Yeah, it's definitely very disturbing. Out of all the material, I'd say it's probably one of the most disturbing things that I've ever come across as well. Simply because it's almost like it's a competition for how low can humanity go. Mm-hmm. You know, taking something like a baby, a child, an unborn fetus, which, as we will see, is a living being, right? It's not like when these women go for an abortion that the baby isn't necessarily even dead. In fact, if you look at what some of the quotes that they provided actually provided some insight into the procedure which is actually used by these technicians operating on behalf of Planned Parenthood, and then subsequently these biotech companies who are using the fetal tissue for various research purposes. And just to go into that a little bit, but what Planned Parenthood are doing is essentially selling off fetal body parts, primarily to stem cell research companies. So, as I'm sure you're probably aware, or if you know anything about health or modern health research, there's a massive focus on stem cell therapy right now. Right, so stem cells over the past couple of decades have really jumped into the research, and they're being heavily researched for a variety of benefits that they can provide in terms of improving people's health, right? And so there's some pretty big names. I think Mel Gibson's father, went for stem cell research. Lots of people are having stem cell therapy, and it's really having good results. But no one really necessarily questions, where did they get these human stem cells from? And it appears that many of them are actually being provided or are being sourced from aborted fetuses. Okay, and so there's actually a very lucrative market involved there, and it seems that a bunch of individuals kind of jumped onto this and have been making quite a large profit off of that over at Planned Parenthood. And so just to give you an idea of the kind of procedure that goes on here, it's important to know that the stem cell scientists have explicitly said that the fetus needs to be born alive for the specimens to be viable for research. Okay, so essentially what we think of as an abortion, which is almost, I guess, our idea of it, or my idea of it previously, was a painless death for the baby, a quick death. But it turns out that actually a lot of these procedures do not kill the babies. In fact, there are certain techniques which are used specifically by these biotech companies, using something called the old perfusion technique, which is called the Langendorf method. And what this method is used for, or what it was traditionally used for, was extracting living hearts from animals. They applied this to living fetuses, and essentially what they've been doing is, essentially extracting living babies without killing them, right? Without killing the baby. And there are accounts from some of the whistleblowers who've come out and said that they have had to dismember a 25-year-old or 25-week-old fetus and been forced to cut open the baby's face to procure its brain whilst the baby's heart was still beating. Okay, so the baby was essentially alive in terms of the biological definition of being alive anyway, and they were essentially performing murder, right? There was another account of a technician who admitted that she knew how to manipulate a fetus on an ultrasound to get it into a breech position in order to secure an intact head removal. She was also discussing about how to get intact fetuses, including the ones with beating hearts, and how to tear the heads from the body without damaging the other organs. So this is pretty evil stuff right there.
Yeah.
And this is... Planned Parenthood receives quite a lot of funding, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they do. Yeah, and it's kind of... I mean, I'm not surprised that this is going on. You know what I mean? It's kind of like the way that abortion has been kind of promoted and elevated. Of course, somebody's making money off of it, right? I mean, inevitably, it seems like when something gains a lot of traction and people are really kind of, it's like a hot button topic that everybody's talking about or everybody's has a very strong opinion on, it seems like there's somebody capitalizing off that in some way. So, yeah, I mean, the other thing is that, like, in many cases that this is illegal. Like, in a lot of states, there are rules about what has to be done if in an abortion if the baby is actually still alive. And essentially, they have to try and save it. So for them to be purposely aborting these fetuses and keeping them alive in order to then kill them and take their body parts, it's something out of like a sick dystopian like science fiction novel or something like that.
Yeah, indeed. And unfortunately, the majority of people aren't aware of this. And it's a shame that this particular case that you're talking about, Doug, with these journalists, essentially what these journalists wanted to do was shine light on how evil this practice actually was. Mm-hmm. And it seems that the biotech companies have kind of turned it on its head and are trying to claim that the journalists were illegally recording the activities,
right?
Such as when they were going undercover, they were illegally recording it, and therefore the material could be damaging for the reputation of those companies. Right.
And the fact of the matter is that the guy, Degrading, I believe his name is, actually they checked with lawyers beforehand to see, like, you know, if we do this and we collect this information, is this considered legal? And they were told that it was. Now, you know, that's not necessarily a defense, but I mean, they kind of did their due diligence to find out if they could actually be prosecuted for this, and we're told that they couldn't be, that it was legal what they were doing. So I just find it interesting that they're still being sued for it. But the good side of things is that if the lawsuit wasn't actually going on, much of this information probably wouldn't have come out. You know, the fact that these companies are going after the reporters is kind of bringing a lot to light, because there are, although there's more or less media silence on it, there are at least some websites that are actually releasing information from the actual trial itself, which is how all this information is getting out. It's not really a surprise that the mainstream media, with its like strong liberal bias, would be ignoring all this kind of stuff. Like, they don't really want to paint abortion, like anything bad against abortion, which is, like, you know, a hard-won right and you know, glorified, as I said before. But it's funny that their, you know, Planned Parenthood's lawsuit has kind of brought everything out into the open. Whereas, you know, if, well, no, I guess if they had ignored it, it probably would have come out in the open too, because the videos have been circulating so far. But it just seems like there's the whole Streisand effect, where the more you try to shut something up, the more attention it actually ends up bringing on itself.
Yeah. And if there's any, I mean, it would be lovely to see the day that these companies are held accountable for this, because I think what they're doing is technically against the law, right? And by any regular definition, they are committing mass murder on a frequent basis, probably unbeknownst to the people who actually go for abortions, which is not providing informed consent on that level. So if there's any justice in the world, then these people will be held accountable. But since it's on the topic of our show, I think this whole topic can serve as a very useful reminder, or can, for me at least, highlights just this overall tone that is now become somewhat acceptable in society at large. How these things can go on, and there is not mass uprising against it, right?
Yeah.
And because, as you've said, Doug, abortion was once something which was, and I think on any side of the kind of political social spectrum, whether you identified as liberal or as conservative, the idea of having an abortion was kind of the end, the last resort, so to speak. Back in a time when couples would take responsibility for their behavior, and if they were going to have unprotected sex, then they would be more likely to accept the potential consequences that went along with that decision. But in today's modern world, how this idea of abortion is somehow equivalent to liberation, right? And this is the kind of idea that is promoted by liberal thinkers, right? And that how it's freedom from oppression to be able to abort a fetus willy-nilly.
It's quite disturbing. It really is. It's kind of like, it seems like the divide was kind of like the conservatives were like, excuse me, they're like, no, it's a life. This is a life. We have to consider this thing a life. Whereas the other side of it was like, no, it's not really alive until about, they picked like these arbitrary dates or something like that. So, of when that is actually considered a life. But, well, I forget where I was going with this, but essentially it just seems like it's becoming more and more dehumanizing all the time. And that they're treating, the human body kind of as a factory for pumping out parts.
And this is not just the these biotech companies who essentially see it as a business model, but this kind of mindset is filtering out into the general public. And although this might not be a common thing that is kind of commonly accepted at the moment, it does appear to be popping up here and there on the internet. We see that there was actually a video posted by Paul Joseph Watson not long ago, earlier on in September, explaining something very disturbing. In fact, the article was published on SOT, and it was titled "We Live in Hell." It's talking about a new sexual fetish that has been kind of that a couple have written about, or an individual has written about online. I think it was on Reddit, I believe. And so the comment went something like this. It says, "My girlfriend enjoys her pregnancies, and then she also enjoys the abortion." So in a Reddit post entitled "Question Regarding Abortion and Breeding Fetish," one user reveals how she has a female friend who has a really powerful fetish for breeding and yet has never used birth control. Apparently, this individual is with a male partner currently who is just like her, who's into breeding, and they've been practicing their fetish for quite a few abortions. So this couple have essentially been bragging about the idea that they get some sick sexual pleasure, or some kind of pleasure, whatever it is, in essentially conceiving a baby, and then following that out through the pregnancy, and then having an abortion. And that provides them with some kind of satisfaction. Another male respondent on that thread also shared details of his own abortion fetish. So he says, "I know this fetish. My girlfriend and me have the same fetish. My girlfriend enjoys her pregnancies and then she enjoys the abortion. Her preferred date to abort is between 20 and 24 weeks of gestation. I enjoy making her pregnant, and I enjoy the time of her pregnancy. She has no menstrual period, and she is very sexually active. In the last 10 years in our relationship, we have done 7 abortions, and my girlfriend is pregnant again with a little girl."
Yeah. Oh, man. What can you say about this? I mean, at first it was kind of like I couldn't really believe that such a thing existed, but there's a number of people who have actually replied on that thread apparently, and like agreed and said they either know people like this or they are like this themselves. They have this kind of fetish. It's really like that's just taking it to another level, you know what I mean? It's like it's not enough that you have some kind of like weird kink, like some kind of sexual fetish that you get off on, like that's not hurting anybody else. Like this is just taking it. It's almost like a love of destruction, like a love of complete degeneracy and like complete devaluing of any kind of human life. It's really disturbing in that way that someone would get sexual satisfaction from that.
Yeah, I would agree there, Doug. It seems very much as some kind of way of sticking your fingers up to creation, right? Complete rebelling against all that characterizes life, and a worship of some kind of destructive principle. And to make matters worse, it doesn't even... it's not only these sick individuals who have these kind of fantasies, but there's people who have commented in reaction to this who are praising them for exploring their fetishes, for being able to I guess to live them out, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the posters says, "This is a wonderful and potent example of personal power, where sex meets violence and creation combines with destruction." It's like way to paint some completely sick and twisted act as though it was some artistic, creative kind of endeavor.
Yeah. It's like it's totally like art, that kind of art talk. You know what I mean? Where somebody's looking at a canvas with a bunch of random splatters on it and starts talking about how wonderful it is, and with all this kind of flowery language. It's that same kind of vibe to it. You know, it's like, oh yeah, it's the combination of creation and destruction and all these kinds of things, as if he's like analyzing a canvas. It's really it's just so dehumanized and so detached. It's like the people are robots.
Yeah, and if someone was to come out and say that just maybe 50 years ago, they'd have likely been locked up.
Yeah.
Or they would have been kind of ostracized and isolated from the average kind of population of people, because they can see that this is absolutely sick.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess bringing it back to this idea that actually in today's world, because things seem to have gone downhill quite significantly, that this is now actually becoming accepted.
Yeah.
And that's what's really scary, because I'm sure that the vast majority of people are never going to have these kinds of fetishes.
Yeah.
But where it really becomes quite dangerous is when the moral compass of individuals or on a collective level in society. So the collective kind of moral compass is degraded to such an extent that the average person begins to accept this kind of sickness as though it were a normal thing, or as though it could be a psychologically healthy idea, without calling it out and without being able to discriminate that. Yeah, that demonstrates that as a whole, things are not looking good. Yeah.
It's it's a good point talking about 50 years ago, because I think that back then a person, it's on par with serial killer kind of mentality, getting off on killing in that sense. I think that nobody would be praised for that kind of thing. It would be these people are sick. They either need help or they need to be locked up, like you said. But it's just kind of interesting, all these kinds of things that we're talking about today. It's there's the concept of the Overton window, where it's kind of there's kind of a window of things that are acceptable to kind of talk about, or positions to have on certain issues. And the more extreme things get introduced, and if they're outside the Overton window, it's that's outside of what's acceptable, but it kind of ends up shifting that Overton window, so that suddenly more things, it starts to encompass more that's acceptable. So it kind of seems back before, we were saying, the whole abortion thing, it was okay, we accept that abortion maybe in some cases is necessary, and it's kind of a last resort. But now it's shifted to such an extent that there's a sexual fetish about it. How much of this Overton window shifting has actually gone on? Now, mind you, most people who hear about this sexual fetish are going to be no, that's disgusting. That's not, it's still not acceptable. But if we keep on getting this shifting, how long is it going to be before that's perfectly acceptable? BDSM is already relatively accepted. I mean, you can find references to it in children's book. At least I wouldn't be surprised if you could. So yeah, I mean, just thinking about it in that respect, it's talking about degeneration.
It makes me wonder how much the this isn't a word, but I guess you can understand what I mean when I say pornographizing. Everything, right? So in the media, you have pornographic material which has now become normalized. Pornography shown to children from a very young age. Generally, what was considered pornographic just a couple decades ago is now kind of daytime television. Yeah. Right? And so there are many a psychologist or psychiatrist who have come out there. There have been several books written on this, talking about how some of the effects that pornography can have on the mind, and have on the progression of influences, how it can gradually, the pleasure that it can provide someone actually diminishes over time, and that for someone to continue to gain that same kind of dopamine hit or that same intensity of pleasure, they must gradually move towards more extreme forms of pornography. Right? And this is only a portion of people who expose themselves to this intentionally, right? But I wonder how much these kinds of influences have had, because it seems like these kinds of things are becoming more extreme, right? By the day, things are gradually getting more extreme, and like you said, with the Overton window, it seems that it's being pushed that further afield. So what was never accepted is now slightly more acceptable, just because something a little bit more crazy has been introduced into the mix. And you can see how generation after generation, just looking through recent modern history, generation after generation, things that were once never acceptable or were unacceptable are now thoroughly accepted and fall under the umbrella of liberation and of freedom of speech and of freedom from oppression, right? From societal oppression, I wonder whether in many cases this is pathological minds which are using language, which are using terms like freedom from oppression just to describe a situation where society does not accept their sick and twisted and unhealthy fantasies, their unhealthy drives. And at some level, there are individuals who seek to push society towards a place where their own deviancies, when their own kind of pathological drives are actually accepted en masse.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what you can see going on here. The drive for people to be accepted regardless of how twisted the what they're into actually is. Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of degeneracy, maybe we can move on to, people might have seen in the news a little while ago, there was a Swedish behavioral scientist who suggested that in order to save the planet, it would be a good idea for humans to start eating humans. Dead humans, as it were. He was saying that it would be a good idea to be eating dead bodies. So, yeah, there was that, and that's clearly not a popular idea. And he was saying that I should explain. He was on Swedish television, suggesting that with the environment in its tailspin downward, we should turn towards cannibalism because that it will provide a food source. It kind of is similar along the lines of what a lot of news agencies have been pushing lately, is this idea of eating insects. CNN in particular seems to, and maybe even the BBC seems to have had like so many headlines like it would be a good idea for humans to start eating insects, and why aren't we eating insects? What's wrong with eating insects? Well, this guy's pushing it even one step further and saying that we should all be eating people. Mm-hmm. So that was a couple of weeks ago, but just recently there was a town hall that AOC, what's her name? Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah.
Alexandria, that's the word I was looking for. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was saying, was having a town hall meeting, and there was an extreme climate anxious individual who stood up in the crowd. And maybe we can actually play the clip because, yeah, you kind of have to see it to believe it. So, Damien, you want to play that one?
Climate crisis. We only have a few months left. I love that you support the Green Deal, but it's not getting rid of fossil fuel. It's not going to solve the problem fast enough. A Swedish professor saying, we can eat dead people, but that's not fast enough. So I think your next campaign slogan has to be this: we got to start eating babies. We don't have enough time. There's too much CO2. All of you're a pollutant. Too much CO2. We have to start now, please. You are so great. I'm so happy that you're really supporting the Green Deal, but it's not enough. Even if we would bomb Russia, we still have too many people, too much pollution. So we have to get rid of the babies. That's a big problem. Just stopping having babies is not enough. We need to eat the babies. Under this very serious. Please give a response.
Thank you. We'll go ahead.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So we're not entirely sure whether this individual has all of her marbles, psychologically speaking. It seems like she may be a little bit loopy.
Well, I still haven't decided whether or not she's actually trolling. Like whether it's somebody who is actually, like, some of her comments just seemed like almost a little too self-aware or something. The whole idea, like, even if we bomb Russia, it's still not enough. it's like I don't know. Like it kind of seems like maybe it's somebody who is actually aware and is just having a laugh. But at the same time, you're right. It could be somebody who is just. I mean, clearly, if she's serious, she's insane. I mean, that's just insanity. She even had on a T-shirt that said "Save the planet, eat the children."
Yeah, and I guess what it kind of demonstrates is that when you have authority figures who are challenging the status quo, let's say, or pushing that over to window, right, by proposing something as ludicrous as the idea that we should be eating humans to save the environment, then there are naturally going to be people who are more susceptible to these ideas. And if you have someone who maybe is a little bit crazy and, you know, is unable to kind of discern that that's maybe a really bad idea, then they might be more susceptible to that. But I think what that's evidence of, or what it suggests, is that these ideas can or may eventually take root in other people, right? In that people may actually start taking notice. If it carries on, they may not need to be so crazy, right? If it's fed through for long enough and in consistent doses.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing. I haven't decided, or I can't determine whether or not it is just trolling, but the thing is that it's not that far-fetched given how this ideology kind of takes over and the twisted thinking that it kind of leads to. I mean, it's what, it's kind of the planet takes primary importance over humans. The animals, like the vegans, with the animals, takes more importance over humans. It's more important for the animals to be live a lovely, peaceful life and never die or die of old age or whatever, than for humans to actually feed on them. It's kind of like even one further step than that. It's like devaluing of humanity so much that, well, we don't want to eat the animals, so let's eat the people. So it's almost like you can kind of see the twisted logic that ends up getting there.
Yeah, you can see the twisted logic, but it stands as another example of how there seem to be certain agencies, certain influences who are trying to actively tear down the moral fabric that holds humans together, right? It's like there are certain kind of rules, right? Rules in human relationships, in human civilization, the way that we coexist with one another, that don't need to be explicitly said. People just intuitively know that cannibalism is fundamentally not a good thing.
Yeah. Right?
It's not a healthy thing to do, and that's generally why the majority of humans on Earth do not partake in cannibalism. And it's something that shouldn't necessarily have to be said, but it seems like there are this kind of this whether it's an ideology, whether it's a force, because it seems like there's many different aspects here, but it seems like there are actively forces which are trying to tear down those norms, to tear down I guess the moral framework, to destroy it, and to reduce humans down to biological machines, to nothing more than animals, right? And this seems to be the way that it's going, because if we're nothing more than animals, if we are simply machines, then you could justify eating babies, right? Because animals commit infanticide. There are many animals that commit infanticide. And so that's what it seems like. That's what it seems is happening.
Yeah.
They are trying to degrade us so much that we are nothing more than animals.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too that you're talking about like just reducing it down to biological machines, which is similar to the whole thing going on with using fetus parts for parts. You know what I mean? It's like it's not a human being. It's just a collection of parts that could be used for something else. Well, it's the same thing. It's just a food source. You know, it's just eat the babies. It's nourishment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about tearing down social norms, tearing down or attacking human dignity and kind of sticking your fingers up to the world, to creation. There are people, sad trends, unfortunately. In fact, I think we should.
Go to a different one?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, maybe we should move on to the one recently in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Yeah.
There was, they've recently declared that it's now legal for women, girls as young as 11 years old, it's now legal for them to go topless, bare-breasted in public. This followed a 3-year, I think it was, trial that was going on, or not. They basically this you've probably heard of them before. They're this feminist group called Free the Nipple, and their whole thing is that it's unfair that men are able to go without shirts on, when it's hot or for whatever reason, and women are not. It's considered indecent for a woman to expose her breasts, whereas a man can go shirtless without a problem, and they consider that unfair. Okay, whatever. Maybe there is an argument there. It just seems like, the fact that the real problem I have with this is that they rather than just saying, okay, if you're of the age of consent over 18, then yes, you can go topless, fine. But 10 years old, I mean, that just seems like an invitation for like deviant, pedophilic people to I don't know. I got a problem with this. I do. Yeah. I think that young girls should not be, it's so tough to even go here. Like, on the one hand, yes, there is a point there. It's just a human body, women should be able to show as much as they want. Men should be able to show as much as they want and not get assaulted. Yeah, okay, fine. In an ideal world, that's true. Women should be able to kind of walk around next to naked because they're hot. It's the summertime, whatever. And men similarly. But the fact of the matter is we don't live in that ideal world, and that's basically inviting assault upon yourself. Yes, you should be able to do that because you want to. In a liberal society, it makes sense that you would be able to do that. But we don't live in that kind of society. And the fact of the matter is children going around half naked, it's a problem. Like, there are predators out there who are going to prey on that sort of thing. So I have a problem with it. Indeed.
There is context, and these kind of arguments crumble when you consider that context. When you consider the context, of the modern world. In your fantasy land, then maybe individuals would be able to walk around whilst they were naked, like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, right? We don't live there, right?
No.
And you have to take caution. You have to be ready to protect yourself and your children, and whether it's your wife or your daughter or your sister, quite frankly, it is going to set them up to be more susceptible or more likely to potentially be attacked, right? That's one thing. At the same time, I think that this really provides. It says more about the people who chose to bring in this legislation than it does anything else. And it kind of I think it shines light into what might be going on with their desires.
Well, yeah. I mean, the other thing is that too, like, one perspective on this is, that breasts should not be sexualized, right? It's all about their function is to feed babies, right? There's no reason for them to be like sexualized, but nonetheless they are. So exposing your breasts in public is a sexual display. Whether or not you think it should be like that or not, it is. That's the way it is. People, you can think that it shouldn't be that way as much as you want, but exposing breasts in public is is displaying sexuality in some way. So to open that up to children is essentially sexualizing children. And I do have a big problem with that. I don't think that should be allowed.
And it doesn't mean that women are oppressed, right?
No.
Just because they have to wear bras out in public. That does not equate to oppression. It just equates to, decency, common decency, and personal dignity as well. In the way that things have worked out, that's just how things work. And it works like that, likely for a good reason. It seems to work well, right? And that because we live with these kind of cultural values, with these social norms, simply abiding by those and respecting those is not the same thing as oppression. No. And this is the problem that I think many of these feminists and ultra-liberals come against, is interpreting any social norm, any construct, any social construct, essentially the rules, the social norms that we kind of follow, consciously and unconsciously, these do not equate to oppression, and these are not always bad. They don't necessarily, it's not always a bad thing. And that's the problem. And I think that part of I think it's their stated aims in many cases. They consciously seek to tear these down, right? To destroy these social norms, because they do see them as forms of oppression. And so when you actively try to, when your main value is placed on destroying those social norms, then essentially anything else is fair game. Anything else is acceptable, because if that is your aim, if that is where you are placing your focus, then anything that contributes toward that must therefore be a good thing. And so this is how we see something like 11-year-old girls walking around topless, or something as crazy as the sexual fetishes that we were talking about before, ultra free abortions and all of this kind of stuff. It's like, well, in these people's minds, if that is, because that is not socially accepted, it's therefore oppressive, and therefore if we can I've lost my train of thought.
No worries. Yeah, it's interesting because there was something that Slavoj Žižek had an article on RT a couple of weeks back where he was talking about there's an Australian porn star who is going to be live streaming, or is it live streaming or just videoing? I'm not sure, but it's her birth. And basically, it's making a pornographic spectacle of giving birth. And he was talking, interestingly, about how it's kind of eroding the sense of shame, right? And he was basically talking about how shame isn't necessarily a bad thing. He even said at one point, this element of shame is a condition of our freedom. And I can kind of see what he means. I mean, you can have freedom as long as there's that level of shame there. It's kind of like shame holds things in place. So it's like you do have ultimate freedom to do what you want, but a sense of collective shame about things prevents you from going too far beyond a certain point. You know what I mean? And he said that he believes that the state should regulate what people may or may not commercialize. We should set certain limits. He He says, I would not even call it censorship, just certain legal limitation. We should do that without feeling ashamed of being oppressive. What is important is to maintain morality that tells you that there is something shameful about some acts, that it is wrong to do it.
Yeah, he says there is nothing socially oppressive about some form of shame. Oppressive society for me is not the one where there are certain prohibitions making you keep some things for yourself. So basically, withholding certain parts of yourself. That's not oppressive. They are simply part of some notion of dignity, and I do not think it is social oppression. And it's not, because essentially a healthy society, as per my way of understanding it, is one which can discriminate between the good and the bad, right? And it's actually being able to move towards the good. But to do that, you have to be able to discriminate. And the problem is that it seems that there are many who are trying to push the idea that everything is acceptable and that everything should be valued, even the bad, the good and the bad. In these people's minds, there is no good or bad, right?
Yeah. And it's literally satanic. I mean, what's the Church of Satan guy back?
Do as thou will.
Yeah, do
shall be the whole of the law.
Shall be the whole of the law. That's the one. And that's basically it. That's what we're witnessing right now. It's like no limits on anything.
In fact, it seems as though the further you can push the limits, the better it is, right?
Yeah.
The further you can push those limits, the more free you are. That's how it seems to be. And you see that in other ways. There have been a variety of kind of viral memes or viral videos, videos that have gone viral of people doing really degenerate acts, really things which are quite morally reprehensible. And these individuals seem to be relatively, I would say, quite stupid. Stupid for doing what they were doing and really not considering the consequences, because they have had some pretty dire consequences foisted upon them, rightly so. There have been videos of like a really weird thing to do. Essentially, there was a woman, and this was in June. She was young. I think she was under the age of 18, probably 16, 17. And she videoed herself taking out an ice cream tub from the store. So essentially in the freezer section of a store, taking out the ice cream tub, taking off the lid, licking the ice cream, putting the lid back on, and then putting it back in the freezer for someone else who's going to go purchase it later on.
Yeah.
To unknowingly, purchase the ice cream tub that she's licked. And for some reason, this was considered to be a funny thing to do, right? And this, she posted that on Twitter. There was some backlash for that, actually. Again, rightly so. And I think she was arrested later on. There was another guy who did it not long after. This time he licked it. He licked an ice cream tub. He poked it with his finger, and then he put it back in the freezer.
Yeah. And I saw one where there was a transgender woman who took mouthwash off the shelf, took a swig off it, swished it around her mouth, spit it back in the bottle, put it back on the shelf. It kind of comes down to what you were saying before, Elliot, about the fact that there are rules, unspoken rules that kind of hold a community of people together. This idea that you kind of respect, like there's certain boundaries that you don't cross. There's despite the fact that, companies will put different things in to make sure that food can't get tampered with and stuff like that. Yeah, there's always a possibility that somebody could tamper with the food, but it's kind of an unspoken rule that you don't do that. You don't mess with food that you're not going to then purchase. It's kind of like an honor code or something like that. It's like
it's common decency, right?
It's common decency. It is exactly that. So it seems like these people are getting a kick out of pushing those boundaries or ignoring those boundaries and violating those boundaries. It's kind of like the fabric that holds the community together is just being trampled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the active violation of those social codes of conduct and deriving pleasure from that. Mm-hmm. That's what it seems to be. And it seems that that kind of mindset is very much being promoted to some extent. Mm-hmm. And although it's not socially acceptable and it's not openly promoted to do something as stupid as licking an ice cream, but I think it demonstrates an underlying lack of respect, an underlying kind of how can I say it, like this tendency, or this drive to tear things down, to again almost embody a destructive principle. That's the only thing that I can think about here. It's like, okay, all that's good in the world, all that works for people as a whole, let's tear it down.
Yeah. It's a totally chaotic impulse. It's kind of like, I think about years ago, different taboos that people challenged, and there was lots of entire youth subcultures would be basically about pushing against certain taboos. And to some extent, I think that kind of thing is healthy, like it's good. It's kind of like questioning these things that are put in place and like why do we have these rules, and thinking about that kind of thing and like challenging them a little bit. But it seems like it's like the more that has been stripped away, it's like the dross has kind of been stripped away, where before it was like maybe a little bit innocent, and now it's getting down to kind of the fundamental things that hold society together.
Yeah.
And those things are starting to be actively pushed against, and it's kind of like, if you push too hard, the whole thing's going to crumble. And I get the impression that some people out there, maybe a significant number of them, actually want that. They want the whole system to come tumbling down.
Yep. And they have explicitly said that in some of their writings, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there have been various kind of self-proclaimed philosophical thinkers who adopt certain ideologies and openly proclaim to essentially want to destroy everything that all of those things that hold or that bond together communities, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. These people, how you would describe someone as essentially being ideologically possessed, mm-hmm. right, where nothing else matters. And so it seems to be the case with many of these probably well-intentioned individuals who do promote these kinds of ideas, whereby their ideology really shapes and dominates their thinking to such an extent that everything else comes second to achieving the goals of that ideology. Mm-hmm. And if that is the destruction of human decency, then albeit. If it is the breakdown or collapse of society, then albeit, because if that means freedom from oppression, then great.
Yeah. It's a really naive position, I think. Like, people don't really understand what they're asking for when they're actually, going for that kind of thing. It's kind of thought of as some kind of, like you said, freedom from like oppression, but they don't understand that this could go down a whole entire rabbit hole here. So maybe we should leave it at that. Unless, sorry, you had more to say, Elliot?
I don't know. No, I agree there, Doug. I think that in general, as a kind of roundup, the points that we are trying to make on this show, and we've given several examples, is how over such a short period of time, if you were to go back even just a couple of decades, how things appear on both an intellectual and a moral level to have degraded significantly, mm-hmm. And how many customs or practices which would previously be considered abhorrent by the majority of people are now getting the limelight or the spotlight in the media. And it seems that for the younger generations are being accepted as more of a normal thing to do. And the problem is I think that there's been several writers, kind of historians, people commenting on the cycles that civilizations generally tend to go through, or the characteristics that a civilization or collective as a whole exhibit through the various stages of their development, and particularly before the collapse of the civilization. And there's several thinkers who have commented on this, who've really highlighted that actually it's the moral fabric, the behaviors really tend to degenerate, and it's that degeneration which seems to coincide or precede a complete collapse of civilization.
Yeah, I wonder if that's what we're seeing. It certainly wouldn't surprise me. Well, I guess that is our show for today. Thanks so much for joining us. We will be back next week with another video, another interesting topic. If you are so inclined, please like and subscribe down below. And thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thanks, guys.